Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Abe! Oh, you had me worried crazy.
Sorry we're late, Phil.
The joint's been sold out for 3 weeks. I saw myself refunding $14,000.
Now take it easy. We're ready to go right on.
You are?
Yeah, sure. Come on, fellas. Hurry up. On the run. Now, you just go start the music.
What do you mean?
Go start the music. Come on.
Okay.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, how are you, everybody? Welcome into the box office. It's your pal, Tim Hanlon, and welcome to the Good Seats Still Available podcast experience. We appreciate you finding us. It's our little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And we are honored and pleased to have you here for this week's proceedings. And I think the theme song there is unmistakable. However, I think the movie from where I grabbed that clip is absolutely a rarity. And if you can believe it, there was a movie in 1951, a Columbia Pictures feature presentation called, quote unquote, The Harlem Globetrotters. That was the name of it. Starring Thomas Gomez as Abe Saperstein. Young Dorothy Dandridge was in this movie as well. And it was, as you can hear, rife with all of the original Harlem Globetrotters at that time as well in this feature film. One of many explorations and exhibitions, if you will, not only in terms of their play, but also in the realms of television and movies and music and performances and all that kind of stuff. And that is part of the fun fest we have for you this week as we talk about the world and the life of Abe Saperstein, the guy behind all of this Harlem Globetrotters mania that continues to this very day with our guests this week, Mark and Matt Jacob, the brothers Jacob, I like to call them, who are the authors of this great very incisive and long overdue book about the life and story of Abe Saperstein. It's called Globetrotter, How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports. It is coming out on October 1st, which I think is pretty darn close to when we're going to be dropping this episode. Yeah, I think we're dropping this episode as we tweak our feeds on the 30th of September. So if you're listening to this episode today, the 30th of September, well, you can pre-order it now wherever you get good books, including Amazon or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You just search up this episode with Mark and Matt that you're now going to enjoy in a few moments' time. It's episode number 363, on our website. And you'll find a couple of convenient links to the book. You can get it in hardcover or Kindle version. And you'll get it as quickly as humanly possible. If you're listening to this episode on October 1st or beyond, it is available now. So you will have even less friction between your typewritten requests via our website to Amazon to get this book as quickly as possible. You will enjoy it as thoroughly as I did, I assure you. And you're going to hear in our conversation with the brothers Jacob This is a story that surprisingly has never really been told. Sure, there have been sort of hagiographies and articles and stuff, and clearly everybody knows the Globetrotters from various media as well as their never-ending touring and performances all over the planet. But the definitive biography really hasn't been done before, and I was surprised that none had been. And as were, I think, Mark and Matt as they were sort of setting out to do this project. But you're going to hear in this discussion some really interesting insights and some really interesting perspectives about the man that was Abe Saperstein and the unlikely relationship that was struck between a bunch of very talented African American basketball players and this Jewish businessman / hustler guy who was a sports fan and a basketball fanatic, and how they came together, how they created what is now just an absolute juggernaut and a worldwide sensation, and all the various tributaries of that story too. The NBA basketball franchise that Abe Saperstein found elusive in what he did, despite having this mammoth franchise known as the Globetrotters, in order to somehow further his professional basketball dreams. A little thing called the American Basketball League, and we'll talk about that and all the other stuff that Abe was involved with. Minor league and major league and Negro League baseball makes an appearance, and other sports too. So it's a fascinating discussion, and I know you'll enjoy it. And let us present it to you now. So sit back and please, as always, enjoy this conversation. Here we go with Mark and Matt. Let's talk about Abe Saperstein. Please enjoy. So maybe for our audience, a little bit of background about the two of you, how you first met each other, wink, wink, and what your proverbial day jobs and or careers and whatever's have been or are, and importantly, the adjunct to this story, your interest in it, and why collaboration on the book about it.
You want to take that, Matt?
Yeah. So I started out in journalism, but I kind of left that path pretty early on once I got out of college. And that's a path that Mark followed a much longer spate of time than I did. But I moved to Washington, D.C. We both grew up in the state of Arkansas. And I currently work as a communications consultant with public health organizations. So that's what I work on. I have a number of clients and an interesting field. And Mark can tell you what he's up to these days. But 14 years ago, we co-wrote a book called "What the Grade Ate," and we've had pretty similar interests. We're close as brothers go, and we sort of put together this book. And it had been a while since we talked intermittently. Hey, maybe we should write a book together. Or what do you think? What would you like to write about? And Mark several years back co-authored a book on a very interesting person that many people didn't know much about in American history. And that got me to thinking about a biography. And so we started kind of playing tennis a little bit, hitting an idea in his direction. Then Mark would kind of email me something. We'd chat about it when we got together. And quite honestly, Tim, the deeper we got into researching and reading and interviewing people about Abe Saperstein, we were stunned that no one has ever written a biography about him. I mean, he's a fascinating character, and just all of the impact that he had on basketball, on baseball, on integration of sports, in the 20th century. All of these things were just huge to us and made us feel all the more committed to this task. But I'll let Mark tell you about what he's been doing with it.
Yeah, so I'm a former Metro editor at the Chicago Tribune, so I was in the newspaper business for 40 years, and I'm a freelance writer, and I love sports, but I also love history, and I like politics, and I like frankly, this story has it all. I mean, it's about how the Abe Saperstein, the guy who was born in London to poor parents who were Polish Jews. They came over to Chicago when he was, about five, and he loved sports, and he became a real. First, he became kind of a coach of a baseball team, and he worked in the Park District and that kind of thing. But he was kind of aimless. He didn't really know what he was going to do. But he got to meet these these folks on the South Side, black people who were playing sports, and they were, they were very talented, and Abe got along really well with them, and so he took him out on the road. And Tim, the reason this story is so great is because it's just the audacity is something. You have this short Jewish guy, and he was short. He was 5'3", and so for a 5'3" person to make an enormous impact in basketball says something. And he took, five young black players from the South Side of Chicago out on the road, going to, predominantly white towns in the Midwest in a Model T Ford, and, surviving on crackers and sausages, and sometimes not being allowed in hotels, and sometimes being kicked out of restaurants and stuff. So it was a real hard scrabble existence for them, but just through sheer doggedness, Abe turned the team into one of the most famous basketball teams of all time.
All right, let's back up for a second. So this is a guy who emigrated to the United States when he was what, 4 or 5 years old, right?
About five.
And he comes to Chicago, where we domicile ourselves, and a stone's throw from a high school that he went to, and I guess discovered sports and stuff. But maybe a little background about his coming to the United States, the arrival, this is around the time of the 1900s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
And kind of understanding like what it was to be an immigrant in the city of Chicago as as a Jewish family, as somebody coming from a heritage of Polish descent, and frankly, a brand new world and new opportunities for both family and young Abe.
Right. Well, he was the oldest of 9 kids, and his dad was a tailor, and they were poor because they had so many kids, and they grew up in Ravenswood on the north side, in a neighborhood that was almost exclusively Irish and German, and he was one of the very few Jewish families, in that area. He actually played on the Catholic baseball team, though. So he really got along with people of all ethnic backgrounds, which was, great training for him when he set off with the Globetrotters to make a talented but black team, extremely famous in an America that was still, largely segregated.
Yeah, his father was trained as an apprentice to be a tailor back in Poland, and they make it over the United States, and just one sign of the barriers that beyond racial barriers, there are ethnic barriers, of course, and he ended up changing his name when he approached a tailor for a job in Chicago. Abe's father introduced himself with the last name of Schneider, which, of course, the irony is it's German meaning tailor. So, and it all worked for him. But, he kind of got it. His dad figured out what a lot of Jewish immigrants figured out, which is you got to sort of think on your feet and find the workarounds. And he did.
Well, it's Abe, I guess, didn't take to the family business per se, although it does seem to me that there was some, at least, interest on Dad's part to continue the family tradition, so to speak. But Abe kind of got bitten by the sports bug pretty early in his life. Maybe a little bit of discovery and understanding of what that was all about. Grade school, high school, and whatnot, and his entrepreneurialism also starting to shine through a little bit.
Well, he was on the high school basketball team at Lakeview High School on the north side, and but they had 3 divisions back then. He was the smallest division of kids who were smallest. It was called bantamweight, and so he played basketball there and was pretty good, but he wasn't really going to go very far. And here's where one of the things when we were investigating this book, and it was not just writing the book, it was investigating things, because Abe Saperstein was kind of a fake it till you make it kind of guy. And he made up a lot of lies about himself in when he was young, and like I said, he was on a championship team in Cleveland, Ohio, which he wasn't, and said he was all state on a basketball team when he clearly wasn't. They didn't even have such a thing as all state basketball back when he was playing. So he was just kind of making up stuff and trying to kind of get an in and become this kind of amazing promoter. And so when he started talking to these great black athletes, he befriended Fritz Pollard, for example, who was a famous early black NFL player. He befriended him, hung out with him, and he started meeting these really great black basketball players and set off with them. Now they called them the Harlem Globetrotters. Abe made up that name, even though they're not from Harlem and they were not Globetrotters. He named them that because it seemed to make sense for him that when they were about to go into these, virtually all white towns, that he wanted them to have some warning that, five black guys and a short Jewish guy are going to show up in your town and, treat them nicely. He didn't want to surprise them and see what you get out of that. So Harlem was a way to signal, hey, this team's black. Globetrotters was a way to act like they had been well traveled when they clearly hadn't. I mean, he would like make up these kind of baloney stories for the sports writers, and the sports writers loved these baloney stories. They just ate them up, all about how he had the best black team in America when he clearly didn't, and how he'd gone coast to coast when he just hadn't. I mean, they started out very carefully going to towns in Iowa and Wisconsin and Illinois, and then they branched out to Minnesota, and year after year they grew until they became famous just on amazing level of determination.
Well, walk me through how he gets to that point, though, right? Because this is pretty audacious. I mean, this is one of his first real professional endeavors, but a lot of it came off the back of, I guess, what you're sort of suggesting there is sort of I don't know, the hustle, is almost like an agent, so to speak, or is almost sort of a prototypical.
Well, he started out as a booking agent, right?
Yeah, or as a prototypical, manager / promoter / whatever. I probably no rule book there, but he sort of recognizes that, hey, there's sports there and around me. Hey, I'm not going to be a player of any great ilk, but how can I be involved in this? And I've got the gift of gab, etc.
Right.
Yeah, his first gig, Tim, actually was baseball. There was a semi-pro baseball team in Chicago. Again, through his contacts on the South Side, he becomes acquainted with this a team called the Walter Balls, Balls, and they're looking to barnstorm, play some games in Wisconsin and maybe Iowa, Western Illinois. And he happily, eagerly says, yeah, look, I can arrange things. I'll set you up. I'll send cables and, letters and tell people we've got a team and so forth. And really the basketball interest kind of grows from that. I mean, he sees the confidence these people have in him. Some of it is quite fortuitous. And I think he was wise enough to know that, black athletes just knew that, a white man reaching out and promoting a team and trying to book games is going to work a lot better than it would work if they just tried to do it on their own. But, it was very clear he had the energy and the persistence. This was just the guy, if you were a vacuum cleaner company back then, oh my goodness, you would want to hire this guy as your salesman. I mean, he was just tenacious.
There are stories of him like calling up sports writers at 2 a.m. to talk about his team. I mean, he was just this force of nature, and that's why they became more famous. And also, the tricky thing they would do, they were beating these teams. Back then there was still this mentality that white teams were better than black teams, and there were some people who even said that black players aren't very good at team sports because it requires too much intellectual ability. So there was this kind of rampant racism there. And frankly, Abe took advantage of it, by having a great team that, won like about 90% of their games. And what they would do in order to not they used to play like local teams. Like you'd get a local college that would play them, or a local team from a local factory. And he would run up to a big lead, and then they would start doing tricks with the ball. They would, throw it behind their back. They would, roll it between the legs of the referee. They would do all the things that you think of when you think of the Harlem Globetrotters today. And they did that in order to, make it entertaining, even though they were blowing out these teams and not blow them out too badly. I mean, they would like slow up the game and clown around in order, to not blow them out in the score. So that because what Abe really needed was those white teams that in these small towns in the Midwest, he needed them to want him back the next year. He needed them to like him and to like his team. And he was super good at that. He was just, I'm a former journalist at a newspaper, and it's just amazing to see how much he curried favor with sports writers. He would like send them boxes of apples and stuff like that. He would do things that are frankly not that ethical in today's world, where he would like you send them gifts, give them watches and stuff. And so he was really working it.
Can you put all this in context? Because we're talking about the 1920s or so, when his basketball Jones, so to speak, becomes apparent, and he's sort of recognizing that he can also manage some of these basketball teams that are playing, and maybe even forming his own, which ultimately became the Globetrotters. But how describe the scene, because this is very much pre-professional basketball. Certainly college was pretty available and out there, but this is way before even the earliest days of what ultimately became the NBA back in the day. You're also mentioning, I think, or hinting at company teams, right, which were a thing certainly for baseball too. Give us some background as to sort of like even why or how this was even a thing, these exhibitions, I guess, of the sport, I guess, in a vacuum where there wasn't even a professional kind of league to even create these teams.
Well, yeah, the thing about it is that there wasn't, pro basketball was really disrespected. Nobody really thought much of it. College was king. That was true with football too, way back then. And so the college game was bigger. Abe couldn't get much respect, but it was dogged determination. The game was so much different then. I mean, you could goaltend, and um, until like 1938, every time you scored a field goal, you did a jump ball in the center court. I mean, that didn't change till 1938. So the game just looked a lot different. And one of the things Abe changed basketball in so many ways. And Tim, the research for this, we learned so much that we didn't know. And this man is so underappreciated in the history of sports because of all the stuff he came up with. But I mean, the Globetrotters were really pushing for the fast break. I mean, they were part of the whole movement to do fast breaks. So the game was super slow when it was kind of just a white folks game that with very few black teams. It was, you were like obligated. Matt, you can like talk about this a little bit if you want, but
Yeah.
you were obligated to like pass the ball and pass the ball and pass the ball. Everyone had to like touch it pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, it was just considered the way to do it, right? You bring the ball, you win that jump ball, hopefully, and then you kind of congregate your team on the offensive side of the court, and you're going to pass not once or twice or three times. You're going to pass at least a half dozen times. Coaches really look down on their players taking a basket sooner than that. I mean, it was really viewed as this very slow-paced, deliberative game, and it's interesting that one of the head basketball coach at Tennessee State is looked at now as one of the forerunners of the fast break, somebody who really pioneered that at the college level. And it's no surprise to me that roughly 5, 6, 7 players who were recruited by the Globetrotters played at Tennessee State. So, I mean, Abe had an eye and had an awareness of like how basketball could change, how it was changing. And he was smart enough to realize, less than trying to praise, the so-called up-tempo, right, fast break kind of game as being good or bad for basketball. He picked up that it was entertaining for fans. He knew it just was a new thing that played well. And so, it worked well with fans. And so he ate it up. I mean, this is a guy who really was, he was always thinking of what's the new thing I can do to wow the crowd, to make them just a little happier than they were the last time we came into town. Connie Hawkins, a former Globetrotter player, called Abe a connoisseur of laughter. I mean, he had this ability to really pick up. Okay, they liked this okay tonight, but when we were here 18 months ago, the crowd laughter was more intense, and
Right.
guys, we gotta work on this. Like, what happened? I mean, he really was a perfectionist, and he really had that ability to kind of pick up very quickly. Oh, they're really loving us tonight, or that antic didn't go over too well.
He also had the ability to figure out count the crowd in a matter of seconds. I mean, he was the expert at just looking around, and he could tell them what the take was going to be. And it's we Tim, we start the book with a really probably the most important game in Globetrotters history. I think it's the 1948 game between the Globetrotters and the Minneapolis Lakers. And the Minneapolis Lakers had George Mikan, who was probably the best player in basketball. He's bespectacled, he looked kind of like a little studious because he had glasses, but he was very tall, and he had played for DePaul in Chicago before, and the coach at DePaul, Ray Meyer, had gotten him dance lessons to help improve his kind of dexterity and his footwork, and he was pretty much the best player in basketball. And the Minneapolis Lakers were considered the best team in basketball, and they went and played the Harlem Globetrotters in an exhibition game in 1948 in Chicago Stadium, and the Globetrotters won on a last second shot. And I think most of the experts figured they wouldn't even stay in the gym with them. That the Globetrotters just were a show team. They were just a bunch of clowns, and they really couldn't play. But they could play. I mean, and that's 1948, and the NBA integrated in 1950, 2 years later. And two of the players who first led that integration were former Harlem Globetrotters. And so so that game really showed people that Black people could compete and dominate, in some cases, basketball. And so it was a super important game to show the world what Black players could do. And we don't need that explained to us in today's world, but they did then. It was. I mean, there were in the book we point out that James Naismith, the inventor of basketball, his mentor wrote a chapter of a book where he explained that only Anglo-Saxon people can play the team sports. That they're the only ones with the intellectual ability to do it. So there were things to prove, and he managed to prove it. And I don't want to get away. And later, maybe we can talk about the 3-point shot, because maybe the most important thing Abe ever did was you could even call him the father of the 3-point shot. He pioneered it in sports. And nobody knows that. I mean, people don't know that. If you asked them, well, who started the 3-point shot? Almost nobody would be able to tell you. But I hope we can also mention, Abe's importance in the Negro Leagues and in Black baseball.
Sure. Well, we'll get to all that, especially the 3-point thing, because we've had a couple of conversations on some of that in the past, but I want to get a little deeper into it. But back to that 48 game, because it's definitely an interesting point to sort of begin the sort of journey, or at least to kind of juxtapose the before and the after of that game. I think it's lost on a lot of people that this was about a couple of years before the pro game at the time, which was fledgling and was still two tributaries of the Basketball Association of America and the NBL, and ultimately that merged and all that stuff, and Minnesota was dominating that. But this was, you hinted at it, it was almost sort of like one of those early professional boxing matches where it was sort of a black versus white guy, and sort of the both for better or for worse, these players essentially sort of on their backs was this sort of racial tension. And this was played in Chicago, at Chicago State, in the old Chicago Stadium. And, it took on a lot more meaning, almost like not unlike the battle of the sexes in the 70s. Hardly an analogy, but men versus women in tennis. The game, Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King, right? A spectacle, yes, but on top of that, just like this game, right? Not only a spectacle, but also sort of this just tension's the only word I can sort of bring up that essentially it meant a lot more to the game, and arguably it had a lot more outsized value, so to speak, depending on who won the game and the implication of such, even though it wasn't maybe set up originally to be that.
Well, the players themselves, in later years said, well, we weren't thinking about race. It was just, our team versus their team. But clearly other people were thinking about race. And clearly it sent a message that the NBA could not remain, an all white league. It just made it abundantly clear that could not happen. And and you see what's happened since then. This was 1948. Think about that. This is a year after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball. So it was embarrassing pretty much to pro basketball that they were still, they were segregated.
One of the incredible things about that game, Tim, is that also even people who know about the game, many of them don't realize the injury that Marcus Haynes, one of the great Globetrotters of all time, has suffered late in that game. So he takes a tumble down to the court and clearly was hurt, but he gets himself back up again. Saperstein tries to convince Marcus Haynes to come off the field. He'll put in a replacement for him, and Haynes says, no, I want to play. And he does, and Saperstein stays on him. You're not looking good. Are you sure? You look like your back was injured. No, I'm good. He wanted to see that game through. That's how important that game was to Marcus Haynes. Well, after the game, he's not feeling good. He ends up going to the hospital for x-rays. Doctors diagnosed him with a fracture of one of his vertebrae. It's just, it's pretty incredible, but that game meant an awful lot to everybody there. And as Mark said, they look back and say it wasn't so obvious that, that this was sort of a battle of two teams of totally different races. But there was a tremendous sense of pride and maybe without thinking about race per se. These guys, many of whom grew up on the South Side of Chicago, this was important to them.
Yeah, look, and also, remember too that the Lakers were the dominant professional basketball team in the country, in pro leagues and stuff, and the Globetrotters had created over those 20 years or so a legend, if in their own right, by winning all their just about all their games in a sort of very flamboyant and barnstorming kind of thing. So in many respects, right, the average sports fan would probably have known about these two teams, and arguably, even though they didn't officially compete with each other on a regular basis, probably the two best known and or perceived best teams in the quote unquote pro game at that time. So even without that sort of racial overtone, it's almost the best of the best kind of thing, and you look back from today, today's perspective, right? The fact that the NBA or the predecessor, the BAA would allow this kind of game to happen. It certainly wouldn't. It's not unlike the AFL challenging the NFL for a game. That would be unheard of today because there's too much to risk if you were the, shall we say, dominant league at the time.
Yeah, definitely. The Globetrotters played them a second time and beat the Lakers again. Now, after that, there were several games in a row where the Lakers prevailed. But, to show you just how competitive Saperstein is, he wanted to keep playing, and he was annoyed when the Lakers sent the message, no, we're moving on. We're not going to continue to play this as a series. But Saperstein was intensely competitive. But the message had been set, even though the Lakers, prevailed in some of those later contests. The message had been sent that this team may amuse you, they may get you laughing, but boy, they can play a hell of a basketball game.
Tell me. Go ahead.
It should also be remembered that the NBA was struggling and the teams were not making money. They would have double headers where the Globetrotters would play a game and then the NBA teams would play a game, and that would really increase their pull. That was really important to the NBA to do those double headers. And At first, they started doing the Globetrotters game first, and then they'd have the regular league and NBA game afterward. And they found that so many fans were leaving after the Globetrotters game that they switched it up to where they waited and put the Globetrotters game at the end.
So give me a sense of like in the intervening 20 years, right? Where's Saperstein getting these players from? What's his pitch? And how does he even sort of keep this I wouldn't even call it a model alive, right? Which is just got to be exhausting because it's exhibition after exhibition. It's, traveling all over the place to get games and frankly put on a show every night or every other night or whatever. It just has to seem like if I'm a player, I mean, maybe it's the only path as an African American at the time with decent basketball skills to actually have an ongoing pro-like gig, or it just seems like it's and again, putting it in perspective in that time period, it just seems like an outlandish offer, so to speak, and existence. But I'm just curious as to how he's getting these quality players of such a high order that could even challenge the best team in professional league basketball. He must have been one hell of a salesman.
Well, he was. I mean, he was a good recruiter, and keep in mind, when your base is the South Side of Chicago, and the kinds of players who were playing high school basketball and who were playing in sports, there is a pretty good basis to start from. But he was also very opportunistic. The Globetrotters played a game on the road. They were doing one of their barnstorming tours, and they played a team. And they were Saperstein, like his players were just amazed at one of the opposing players, who just was fantastic, an incredible ball handler. And before they left town that night, Saperstein sent word to the coach, "We'd like to offer that guy a job. We'd like him to join the Globetrotters." His name was Marcus Haynes. So, when they would play teams and get acquainted with people, and as they traveled around, as Abe Saperstein and his team is moving through, Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana and Iowa, they're becoming acquainted with these players. This is a guy who is taking in all the information he can. He's any kind of scoops, any kind of intel on, oh, there's this player over here. This was a guy who really was gathering that. And he was a very astute judge of talent too. So, somebody said, "Hey, there's this guy in Milwaukee, this player, he's 16 years old, but he's going to be great." So, Abe he was taking a lot of notes. He was jotting down a lot of names. This was obviously an era where you couldn't text and email. So, he was scribbling down a lot of notes. And obviously when they were playing a team and they had somebody on the other side, a semi-pro team or a community college type team, like the one that Marcus Haynes was playing with, and they see this guy, they're like, "We want that guy."
Plus they were, Abe recruited basketball players through the Negro Leagues team, which he was part owner of, right? I mean, isn't that how Goose Tatum came to the
it
the
is
Globetrotters?
one of the most famous Globetrotters of all. Started off playing basketball. I'm sorry, started playing baseball for the Birmingham Black Barons. And Abe Saperstein happened to have an ownership interest in the team. He was always a big baseball fan. And he's down there, and here's this guy who is an outfield. He was a decent hitter, not a great hitter, but he was a very good fielder, huge hands. And the Barons had him playing in right field for a while. Then they brought him into first base, and they noticed two things. There weren't too many hard hit ground balls that got past him because his arms were so long. He had just an incredible wingspan, and he would stop pretty much any ball that was grounded in his direction. But the other thing was, he had this ability to connect with the fans, and he would spin the ball after he had tagged first base and toss it around. He would do some really kind of amusing things to really play with the fans and toy with them a little bit. And Abe, you can bet, noticed that too. So he said to himself, "This guy has style. This guy has a comical nature, and yet physically, he's an impressive athlete. So, that made a very good decision for Saperstein to say, I think we have a new Globetrotter here.
Saperstein managed to get himself right in the center of black sports in the middle of the last century. I mean, he befriended Jesse Owens. We talked to Jesse Owens' daughter, and she was telling us that her dad and Abe were, close friends, and that her dad always appreciated Abe helping him stuff. Because what people may not know, they may remember that Jesse Owens, won a bunch of gold medals at the Olympics, but what they may not remember is that there weren't very many opportunities for him because the track and field was basically an amateur sport. And as soon as he did something that made him a pro, he couldn't, compete in these meets anymore. And so one of the few people who actually reached out to Jesse Owens to help him was Abe Saperstein. So Abe was friends with Wilt Chamberlain. He was friends with Satchel Paige, a big friend of Satchel Paige. I mean, to where Abe was just put himself right in the middle of all the biggest black sports stars of the era.
Yeah, I mean, even later in the '40s, when Saperstein was pals with Bill Veeck, apparently another great,
Yeah.
he was actually helping Veeck scout African American players for the Cleveland Indians, which Veeck owned at the time, right? And Satchel Paige came in and had his cup of coffee with that team at that time, and Larry Doby, and the first black player in America. I mean, it's like, yeah, what I'm really curious as to sort of, I mean, this sounds so unexpected or odd. This sort of pairing, this sort of, this short, Jewish sports fanatic, yet not a player, great salesman. How does Abe Saperstein become almost this? I wouldn't call him agent. I would call him almost sort of ambassador for the
Oh, yeah.
African American basketball and or baseball player. I mean, it's such an unlikely story. I'm just curious as to sort of how he becomes sort of this magnet for talent and probably more importantly, trust amongst these players, because it doesn't sound like there's a whole lot of opportunities there. And why would these players trust this guy, literally kind of off the street and hustling left and right? There must have been an amazing amount of trust and belief. And you even mentioned it, friendship, to make that happen.
Yeah, it was there was definite trust there. And I think, part of it was, as Mark alluded to, this was a guy who very early on in his teen years, his young adult years, was spending a lot of time around black men on the south side of Chicago, something that you couldn't say for most white young adults. So, I think that comfort level, the fact that there was camaraderie there, I think that came across. I don't think he felt he created this sense that he was on stage or nervous around them. He treated them, I think, as they would hope to be treated. So I think that certainly helped. But I think I think one of the keys for him, what helped A, make business for him, but B, also help keep Negro League teams functioning, was their seasons were relatively short. They didn't play nearly as many games as Major League Baseball, with 154 back then. So part of it was they didn't have the market, a market that was as resilient and affluent as baseball, Major League Baseball had. So basically, they had to rely a lot on barnstorming games where the team hit the road. And, the Kansas City Monarchs, for example, were one of the teams that relied on Abe a lot to kind of set up games where they could send the squad out to Iowa, to Nebraska, to Montana, to Minnesota, and play games and with maybe semi-pro teams that were local. And these were revenue raisers that really helped to balance the books and keep the Negro League teams financially sound. They were very important ones. I mean, this formula worked so well that at one point, the Monarchs actually formed two squads. They had a regular squad that played the Negro League scheduled games, and they had a second squad that did the barnstorming because it was so profitable. So it was very fascinating how it all worked. Negro League teams on the eastern side of the country were a little more apprehensive with using white booking agents. They'd had some bad experiences with some of them, but Saperstein had a lot of trust built up in the Negro American League, which was the teams really in that Midwest, Kansas City, Birmingham, Chicago, those kinds of teams. So it definitely was something that it was a win-win, I think, for both of them.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course, we love them primarily for their sportswear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. So let me get this squared here. So the Globetrotters are around this time. You talk about the 48 game and going into the 50s and stuff. It seems like it's becoming a bigger business, so to speak. I mean, it's a franchise, if you will, and it spawns a number of different teams, and there are teams going all over the world, and the brand, and it's becoming its own sort of entity with worldwide renown. But it's interesting as that continues, and some of the greatest players that sort of went through, like the Will Chamberlains of the world, like you mentioned before. What Chamberlain was even famously said that he almost didn't go to the NBA after during his time for the Globetrotters because he was having so much fun and enjoying himself, and ostensibly probably making a pretty decent living at the time. But I guess the question in there is that wasn't sort of completely satisfactory to him, because he always kind of wanted to still, especially as the NBA now had congealed and was becoming a true professional league of some substance. He envisioned for himself, he wanted an NBA franchise, didn't he? And then that almost, I'm just curious as to that where he's sitting with the Globetrotters, which just seems like it's on fire, right? Where he still wants something he can't have for whatever reason, and that's an NBA franchise. Why is that? And then we'll get into sort of what he decides to do once he finds out that he is unable to secure an NBA franchise.
Well, the thing with Saperstein is, frankly, he was more of a visionary than the NBA was. And he knew things because he'd been touring with the Globetrotters on the West Coast. He knew that the NBA could make a lot of money on the West Coast, but they weren't going there. Their farthest west team was in Minneapolis. I mean, it was ridiculous. And he knew that they needed to do something. And he would keep on telling him, you need to give me either a franchise in Chicago. Also, it should be remembered, Chicago didn't have an NBA team in the 50s or most of the 50s. I mean, it's ridiculous. It was the second biggest city in the country, but it didn't have an NBA team. And so Abe said, you need to either give me a team in Chicago or in Los Angeles. And he kind of would rather have had Los Angeles because, he He thought it would really go over, and it was a boom area because of Hollywood and everything else. And what the NBA did is really snub him. I mean, they let the Minneapolis Lakers move to Los Angeles. That's why a place that has water problems, Los Angeles, is called the Lakers. Because it came from Minnesota, where there are a lot of lakes.
And the irony of coming out of that 1948 game too, right? The fact that it had to be the Lakers
Yeah.
that was the one that took over the thing that he was coveting.
Yeah, and so it made him very mad, and he started his own league for that reason.
Okay,
Yeah.
before we get to that story for a second, why was it so difficult? Why was the NBA not accommodating to this, frankly, this basketball promoter slash genius, right? With this worldwide known brand and team? Was it jealousy? Was it, you said it's not innovative enough, the NBA, but like, why the borderline hostility to let him in?
I think that's a great
Mark,
question. I'll be curious what your answer is, Matt.
Well, Mark can go in more depth on this, but one quick take I have is what worked so well for Saperstein to get covered, to get his team mentioned in newspaper columns. The sports writers loved his freewheeling, very very candid stories and statements. He didn't hold back much. I think that hurt him with the NBA, because all along the way, even as he's seeking this franchise, Saperstein was not shy about really taking a shot at the NBA commissioner or a team executive or something the NBA is doing that he thought was misguided or inappropriate or dumb. I mean, he really did not hold back, and I think there was a point at which, in the category of biting the hand that feeds you or that you hope might feed you, some of those statements, some of the blistering criticisms he had for the NBA probably came back to haunt him a bit.
Yeah, and I think the NBA took itself too seriously. If you look at the NBA in later decades, they're loving the idea of Showtime. But at that time, they didn't. At that time, they were just very serious about being stellar athletes. And they didn't, I think they viewed Abe as kind of the promoter of a clown show. And they really didn't like the fact that people were laughing at people playing basketball. Now, as we've talked about, Abe was putting a quality basketball team out there and was still, having, amusing comic antics and all that stuff. So he didn't think that they were mutually exclusive, but the NBA may have. And I think Matt's entirely right that the NBA leadership was, a little stuffy, and they sure didn't like the fact that Abe would just let loose, because that's another thing that why the press loved Abe, because he would say just about anything. I mean, he didn't mind making enemies, and he was ridiculing the style of play of the NBA and a lot of other things. So they decided to decide not to give him any franchise at all, and just kind of, I think it really hurt him. I think it was one of the things. I think he personally was offended, considering how much he'd done in these double headers over the years to promote the NBA and help make a lot of people a lot of money.
Well, plus he had opened the door, frankly,
Right.
crashed down the door on the integration front, right? Which, not so arguably led to an amazing pipeline of talent in the NBA, and ultimately powered its success in the decades to follow, right? So now some of that's hindsight, right, and historical perspective, and recognizing sort of that, that innovative thinking that Saperstein brought to it. But you'd think that there would have been a little bit more respect, it just feels like there's some jealousy there too. I mean,
Right.
Here's a guy that's basically, showing how the fun of basketball. It's almost like the Savannah Bananas of baseball now today, right? Kind of showing the Major League Baseball that, it's a kind of a stale game, and hey, congratulations, you got a pitch clock. But how about fans who catch the ball in the outfield, in the stands? If they catch it, it's an out. I mean, that's fun stuff for people that are just not sort of align with sort of the fuddy-duddiness, I guess, of it. But all right.
And
So,
it's
yeah.
also important to remember that Abe Saperstein and the Globetrotters were famous in Europe. It became famous around the world. They did a famous, really well watched tour of the Soviet Union, and back when things were really tense. So he was making headlines around the world, and I think that the NBA kind of felt like he, in some ways, overshadowed them, and that he was such a good publicity expert and promoter that he kind of left them in the dust a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're missing out on the ultimate ambassador for whatever the NBA wanted to be or could have been. Now sits on the precipice of being, the globally dominant, arguably already the globally dominant league in the world. So you can
Hmm.
trace that back. All right, so tell me then about what his response was. Tell us about this American Basketball League. We've talked a little bit about this with our old pal Murray Nelson in his book a
Oh,
few years
yeah,
back.
that's Murray has a great book. I
Yeah,
really it was one of the sources we used. He did a nice job.
yeah.
The
So tell me, like, I mean, this is the ultimate sort of like, I'll show them. And ironically, this is around the same time that Lamar Hunt was doing the same thing with the AFL and football,
hmm
because he couldn't join the NFL. So ironic
what
that this is happening in the early 60s at the same time.
well maybe the difference was that they didn't the AFL get a TV deal
Well,
because
for starters, yes, for
yeah
sure.
because that's the one thing that Abe tried really hard to get a TV deal. He started just to start at the start here. Abe got fed up with the NBA and said, "Forget it. If you're not going to do it, I'm going to start my own league." And it's called the American Basketball League. And he wanted to put a team in Los Angeles and he wanted to put a team in Chicago, and he did. But the problem was that so did the NBA. I mean, in effect, he prodded the NBA into getting, off of its couch and to start expanding by him taking action. But at the same time, that meant that, for example, the Los Angeles team, the Lakers, got to Los Angeles a year before Abe's Los Angeles Jets did, and and it was kind of just to show you how the NBA and professional basketball was not that big a deal back then. Is one of the players on the Jets who was really good had started his own engineering company. And so he agreed to play for the Los Angeles Jets as long as he didn't have to travel out of state. So one of their best players was too busy with his engineering company to play in road games. Another thing that Abe had in the ABL was they had a Hawaii team, in which was caused, tremendous problems with travel back then, and cost a lot of money in travel and so Abe's league just didn't do very well. I mean, it just didn't attract people. But it did have something that was really important, which was the 3-point shot.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
before you go further on that, right? He pretty much convinces a bunch of superior amateur teams to kind of make the jump and become professional in
Right.
this league. So there's quality there, but this is obviously a jump from amateurism when it truly existed into the world of professionalism, right? But
Right.
clearly a lot of hurdles. But go ahead, a little bit more background on this because a couple of interesting characters come into play, especially this guy in Cleveland who went on to some interesting things.
Oh, you're talking about George Steinbrenner?
I've heard of him.
Uh-huh. The funny thing about that is everyone thinks, oh, he was this guy who, who owned the Yankees and the Billy Martin and everyone else hated him. And he was like this. He was, when we did the research on the ABL, we found George Steinbrenner was the same person his entire life. And it wasn't really a good person. I mean, he like failed to make payroll, and all these other team owners are they're making payroll, they're trying to make a go of things, and Steinbrenner is doing all these terrible things. He wouldn't turn in his statistics for the rest of the league, so Steinbrenner was just being an idiot pretty much. And the rest of the owners wanted to kick him out, and Abe, had a long meeting with him and decided to let him stay. But that was a black mark on the and Steinbrenner even like refused to play the finals in the first season because he didn't like where the games were located, and so Abe had to talk him into that. So a league that was really struggling was made even worse by George Steinbrenner.
Well, beggars can't be choosy, right? I mean, you got to
Yeah,
stand up. You got to stand up. He wanted to get to at least 8 teams, which he did.
right.
But also it's clear, and we hinted at. I'll let you get to some of the specifics. He wanted to differentiate his league a bit, right, to show the NBA that there could be a more entertaining and potentially more competitive form of the game. Let's go through the list of some of these innovations that he wanted to bring, and he ultimately did bring for that, at least that first, well, the 1.5 seasons of this league's existence. Maybe we'll start with the 3-point shot. Like, where does that idea come from? How does it get implemented? How does it come into being? It's
There,
clearly he's not the only one thinking of this idea.
there was actually, I think it was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York had the idea, and he persuaded 2 New York colleges to try it in an exhibition game. And they tried it, and it didn't really go over. And we found a New York Times story in which the New York Times reporter says, it's not that good. It's just going to die of its own weakness. And the funny thing was that he also disclosed in that article that they polled all the fans at the game, and they polled all the sports writers and all the coaches. And the fans loved it, and the sports writers and the coaches hated it. And for that reason, the New York Times guy thought it was dead. And it was kind of dead because it was another decade before Abe, had heard of the idea and said, we got to do something to, in effect, a gimmick to make to set our league apart. He first wanted to call it the home run, like baseball, and people talked about that. But the thing that's interesting, and we detail this in the book, is that he was helped by Ray Meyer, the DePaul coach. They went out to a Chicago gym. We haven't figured out which gym it was, but they went out to a Chicago gym and just started shooting basketballs and trying to decide what the right length would be. And they settled on 25 feet. And they just arbitrarily picked that. It's just it's what they did. And so they started the 3-point shot in basketball, and it was popular. And they used to, like, the bells that they ring, they used to ring at boxing matches at the end of a round. Well, Abe sent one to every team, and every time they hit a 3-point shot, they would ring it. So he was trying to make a show of it. And so that aspect was good. But then when Abe's league died after a season and a half, no major professional league was using the 3-point shot, and it nearly died. I mean, it was pretty much Abe was the first person. That's why I think you could call him, if you wanted to, the father of the 3-point shot, because he was the first person to put it in a regular basketball league. And but then it died, and then Abe died in 1966. When he died, there was no major league was using a 3-point shot. And it seemed like it was just one of those crazy things that wasn't going to stick. And then the ABA came in 1967, and they were looking to make a difference, and so they picked up the 3-point shot. They eventually died also, and 4 of their teams went into the NBA, but the NBA still was too staid and stuffy, and they didn't have a 3-point shot. So again, it looked like the 3-point shot might disappear from the game. And then after a few years, the NBA realized that it was too boring, that people were bored by it, and they picked up 3-point shot. And then about a decade later, college did. And that's why, Steph Curry and Caitlin Clark, they owe a debt to Abe Saperstein.
He also put in place a wider lane, right?
Right.
From
Right.
the NBA's relatively skinny 12-foot lane. Why that? And also on a shooting clock, not unlike the NBA. People forget that the NBA's shot clock was at 24 seconds. This was years before the ABL came into play. Why
Right.
did the ABL go with 30 seconds instead of the arguably probably faster pace of 24?
I don't know. I think it was arbitrary to some extent, but he wanted to do it his own way. As far as the lane went, Abe, that's funny, when you research Abe, and Abe came up with kind of the 3-point shot, which is transformed basketball, but he came up with a lot of other wacky ideas too. He experimented with a backboard that was curved and crooked. It was not flat. because he wanted to see whether balls coming off of it, rebounds, would bounce crazily and give other players, not just tall players, a chance at the rebound. That didn't work, but it was one of those crazy things he tried. He
Was that,
even
I'm sorry, was that
suggested,
ever implemented in a game or
I think all we found was him talking about it and that he had tried it and it hadn't come to much. I don't know that it ever appeared in any kind of league game. It's kind of a wacky idea when you think about it. I don't know how.
I'd
I mean,
love
it
to
just
find the original. It's got to be. I wonder if it's around. That should be in the Hall of Fame somewhere.
yeah. I don't know whether. Yeah, I would. It was kind of lost to history, but we found a little bit about it. But I would love to know more. He also suggested moving the basket out 15 feet from the back line. He wanted to like do it kind of like they do in hockey, where there's action behind the basket, like that. So, which is crazy too. Some people thought, well, what's he going to do? Is he going to like levitate the rim? But anyway, so that didn't pan out either. So I just mentioned that because Abe liked a lot of different, he liked to tinker. And the thing about that is that the more he could tinker, the more he could talk to sports writers about tinkering, and the more they had columns to fill. And so they loved him for that. But as far as the wider lane, I think that was an attempt to help short players. There were various times when Abe was really pushing for bringing short players back into the game. There was with the Wilt Chamberlain and everything like that, there was a really solid fear that tall players were going to dominate the game so much that short players would just have no place in it. And so I think he felt like a wider lane was going to force the taller players out of the lane more often, and it might be good for the short players. And the 3-point shot was also something that gave an advantage to shorter players.
One of the other rule changes for the ABL that was a bit of a departure was a more liberal use of hands in body contact. So Abe tended to be, Abe Saperstein was somebody who liked the defensive element in basketball, and which seems kind of odd, right? You're like, well, hey, he pioneered the 3-point shot. What's that about, right? But again, in many ways, he wanted to pull the play kind of outside of the lane and not make the big guys inside posted up as sort of the only key scorers. And so in many ways, that was kind of his thinking there. He also was just looking for a gimmick there, but there's a lot of talk where, a lot of newspaper articles, a lot of columns where he's riffing on the game, and he's talking about how defense is important and rules should really make sure they uphold that the defensive play and don't lead to too many fouls being called on defense. So, there are as many times where he's getting frustrated because the officials who are refereeing the games that his Globetrotters are playing, in his opinion, were a little too strict. And didn't allow, the so-called touch foul, right? It's like, come on, let him mix it up a little bit. And I think he'd be pleased to see where the NBA has gone on that, where there's a much more physical kind of a battle, kind of going on that's not so evident unless you're like right on the court. But where defensive players are definitely holding their ground, placing their hand on the person with the ball, really pushing it, and there is that physicality. So I think that was a lot of where he was coming from on this.
What's happening with the Globetrotters during this ABL time? Did he hand it off to somebody, or was somebody else running it? He wasn't running it as well as running this league, was he?
Well, because the Globetrotters were still the cash cow, he was paying a lot of attention to the Globetrotters and not enough attention to the ABL. There were several times when the other ABL owners were really ticked at him because he like went down to South America to join the Globetrotters because he was worried about the shaky political situation down there. And this was right in the middle of a giant crisis for the league. So the Globetrotters kind of went on. The thing about the Globetrotters in the 60s is there was some transformations. They started to not. They had 3 teams in the 50s. They had 3 different teams touring sometimes. And they ended up getting rid of one in the 60s. They just weren't making quite as much money, and they did start getting on television sometimes, and that helped them. But they just didn't do all that well. And the thing about it is that the Globetrotters ended up getting a second life after Abe died when they had Saturday morning cartoons with them, and there was a little more marketing, aggressiveness.
Well, his son became involved after the fact, right? Didn't Jerry sort of help maybe resuscitate and or take it to another level as the '70s dawned?
No, I think they wanted him to,
Oh, sorry.
but he didn't. Now there was some tension there, and some of the people who worked at the Globetrotters organization wouldn't have it. So the family ended up, because the inheritance taxes were high, the family ended up selling the Globetrotters a year after Abe died in 1966. But
Interesting.
they still pay a lot of attention to it. I've interviewed many times the Abe's granddaughter, Abra Berkeley, who is kind of the keeper of the family story. And she's just a passionate believer in the importance of her grandfather and what he meant to the sport, and also what he meant to race relations too. Because one of the things after Abe died, his daughter, Abra's mom, Eloise, she like started this foundation, and they did a lot of events for inner city kids, the basketball leagues and stuff like that. And so she was really active in that. In fact, Isaiah Thomas at his Hall of Fame induction, he called her out as somebody who had helped him when he was a kid.
Well, I do want to wrap up with your into a nicer bow his legacy and ongoing um, you know uh, 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 contributions to the game, to sports, to race relations, and all that stuff. But before I get to that wind up question, what this is a wacky proposition, but it seems logical in hindsight, but probably it didn't at the time. Was there, from your investigation, from your work, your research, was there ever any thought that the Globetrotters could be a part of this ABL, be kind of like the crown jewel of that league and be the best team in that league going forward, maybe picking one of their touring teams and having it part of the league? Or was it always determined or always envisioned that they would be separate entities? One would be a true league competitor to the NBA, and the others would be still the traveling barnstorming brand that was the Harlem Globetrotters. Because you wonder, right, if you had this arguably best team in the world and having
Hmm.
them, or at least a version of them, in this league, it seems like it would automatically jumpstart attraction for it. But I just wonder if there was ever any thought about maybe doing that to
You
get
know,
this thing off the ground.
in all of our research, we never found any indication that they even thought about that. I think that the Globetrotters that was the crown jewels. That was what was making all the money, and that was the brand name. And I think Abe didn't want to mess with it. I think he was worried that if I think he knew he was taking a big risk with the ABL. And some people thought that Abe was just doing it out of spite. They used to call the ABL the Spite League, that he was just doing it to punish the NBA, even though he knew it wouldn't work. And I think Abe and his friends would tell him that maybe you ought to not do this, Abe. Looks really risky. So I think he knew it was risky, and I don't think he wanted to risk the brand name of the Globetrotters. So I don't think he did. But it's a really good question, and we were curious about that too. And we never found any indication that they ever considered that.
Sadly, he died a few years after the dissolution of the ABL, and of course, he did not get to live to see um, the formation of the ABA in 1967. Do you think he would have been in the mix for that ABA when it was casting about, and the various hustlers, if you will, that were putting that thing together? I find it hard to believe that Abe wouldn't have been part of that mixture, at least in that conversation in the latter part of the decade, had he not passed away so early.
It's an interesting thought. He might well have been. The question is, would the negative experience of the ABL be enough to render him a little more cautious? Something that Saperstein was not super cautious. I mean, he was somebody who was willing to take risks. But even said, the fact that the ABL folded might have made him think twice about it. But I think it's fair to say ABL people, if Abe were still around at that time, someone would have reached out to him and said, "Hey, you want to put a stake in on this?"
Yeah, I think that's almost the kind of sad thing about it is that maybe if Abe had lived longer, there might have been a place for him in the NBA or the ABA. Now, the current Harlem Globetrotters do say they wish they had an NBA team and they would want an NBA team, but that doesn't seem practical. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen, but it is something they still to this day talk about.
He posthumously was inducted into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame in 1971, which is about 5 plus 6 almost 6 years after his passing. It's very interesting because um, you'd have to think that the forces of the NBA might maybe not have been quick to want to bring him into that to the extent that they had influence in the Hall of Fame. But I think even in the years shortly after his passing, right, it's undeniable that his influence was already cemented and his legacy already growing, that it would have been impossible to have kept him out for any long period of time, right? Because even though he created this potentially spiteful American Basketball League, even though he was outspoken against the NBA and this Harlem Globetrotters thing that he created literally, from scratch in the 20s, was overshadowing a lot of what was going on in the professional game in the United States. Um, it's pretty clear that without Abe Saperstein, you might not have even had a fledgling NBA in the 1970s to even and Lord knows the NBA was slinking along in the 70s.
Right. Well, and Tim, another thing, just to throw it in, is you see today in today's NBA, you have all these international players who are making an impact. And Abe and his Globetrotters were extremely influential in the popularity of basketball worldwide. They were going a lot of places where nobody had ever seen a basketball game before. They were evangelists for the sport of basketball. And so when you see these great foreign players come into the NBA now, that's part of that is Saperstein too.
Yeah, after Saperstein's death, the Detroit Free Press sports writer by the name of Lyle Smith wrote a column, and he mentioned that the U.S. Postal Service had just recently issued a stamp featuring basketball founder James Naismith. He wrote, "Naismith put basketball on a postage stamp, but Abe is the guy who made it stick." I think that kind of wraps it up pretty well.
He is his resting place is in nearby Norwich, West Lawn Cemetery. How I guess sort of the final question: how, aside from the ongoing success of the Globetrotters, obviously it's been it's a traveling phenomenon, and it comes through a city near you every year, and and the branding and the movies and the cartoons and the just all of it is still very strong, and I'm sure a very continuously successful franchise. Aside from the Globetrotters and where else do you sort of see the legacy, and or where would be sort of the soul, I guess, of his ongoing legacy? Is it with that team, or is it in Chicago with their, should the NBA be more reverential, perhaps, maybe on an ongoing basis somehow in terms of his contributions to the game? You mentioned before that there really wasn't, a substantive biography of the man until now. Maybe why is that, and maybe where should some of that legacy reside, aside from people who just might happen to go to Springfield to see him in the Hall of Fame?
Well, just to answer the question of why no biography, we've asked that question. The thing about it is Abe in the 60s when this civil rights movement was moving on and the way black people were depicted in our society was really put under scrutiny. Some people didn't like the idea that the Globetrotters were mischievous clowns, or that they seemed childlike to some people. And so there was some criticism of it. And so I think that in some ways Abe fell in disfavor in the 60s and 70s, there was a book by Connie Hawkins, in which he was interviewed in the book, in which he called it Uncle Tommen. He said, so it was stinging words that happened after Abe's death, but that have affected his legacy to some extent. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to do the book is we wanted to examine that. We wanted to examine, did he say racially insensitive things? And yes, he did. Did he empower Black people in his organization? And yes, he certainly did. I mean, he gave responsible jobs to plenty of Black folks in his organization. So it's a mix. It's a mixed picture, and I think because of that, and because people did not tie him appropriately to the 3-point shot, I think he kind of faded away. And the foreword in our book, Globetrotter, is by Manny Jackson, a former Globetrotter player who ended up buying the team. He ended up being a corporate success and buying the team in the 90s. And he talks about how much he learned from Abe, and how Abe shared his business records with him and explained to him how he was doing it, because Manny was a good basketball player, but he was a better businessman. And so I think that Manny, who's written the foreword to our book, has, I think, helped frame what should be a new assessment of Abe, and viewing him as somebody who would take chances, who was a visionary in so many ways, and was just really working for the fans. That he was, he just wanted to entertain people. And I just feel like this book has been an opportunity for us to create a new assessment of Abe, and I think to repair what's been a case where somebody's been vastly underappreciated in the history of sports and of race relations and of society in the last century.
Yeah, I also think that the NBA game that we see today is so reflective of the sense of style, the sense that it's not a game, it's a show, that was at the heart of Abe Saperstein and how he operated. So many of the players that came along, from Pistol Pete Maravich to Magic Johnson, it was more than just talent as well. They had a style. They had a way of dazzling fans, and it led a lot of people, including the NBA and sports writers in the 80s and 90s, to use that term Showtime. To me, that's kind of a tip of the hat to Saperstein, and in many ways what the NBA is today, and how a once second tier sport has become front and center in the sports ecosystem here in the U.S. and even abroad, is a tribute to Saperstein and the way he thought and the way he operated.
All right, our thanks to Mark and Matt, the brothers Jacob. The book is a wonderful read. It is really enlightening, and like I said earlier, we've all agreed upon it, is the overdue biography of Abe Saperstein, an underappreciated legend in the evolution of professional sports and modern day sports, for sure. The book is called Globetrotter: How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports, by the aforementioned Mark and Matt Jacob. You can find it wherever good books are found. It is published by Rowman and Littlefield. And of course, we'd appreciate it if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with the brothers Jacob at, let's see, the number is 363. And you'll find a couple of convenient links there to Amazon. And we'll get a couple of referral shekels of love. And we appreciate that. Helps keep our bills paid and our lights on. We tip our hat in your general direction in honor of your decision to purchase the books that way. We appreciate that. For all our books, for that matter, and all of our various media and stuff. All of our episodes are on our website at Good Seats Still Available. And while you're online, you can follow the boys and their efforts, both on the web and in socials. So here they are. On the web, you can follow the book and the journey at Mark Jacob Books. So it's M-A-R-K. Jacob is J-A-C-O-B. Books, B-O-O-K-S. MarkJacobBooks.com. On the socials, you can follow Mark on the Twitter X thing at Mark Jacob 16. You can follow Matt on the Twitter X thing at MattInDC Tweets. So that's Mark Jacob 16 or Matt in DC Tweets. On Threads, you can find them in the following places. You can follow Matt at Matt9 Jacob on Threads, and you can follow Mark at Mark Jacob News on the Threads. There you go. So no excuse to not get more goodness from either of the Jacob brothers, and more on this great book and amazingly interesting topic of Abe Saperstein and all that came from his doings back in the day, the Harlem Globetrotters being prime among them. Let's see, what else? You can follow, like I said, all of our episodes and stuff, but make sure that you rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure you tell a friend or two or seven. We appreciate that. We always like to add more listeners to the frivolity here. You can send us some email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com, and you can follow us on the socials as well. On the Twitter X thing, you'll find us at Good Seats Still, and you'll find us just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available. Our thanks, of course, as always, to the great Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, audio excellence, coming through once again. Thank you, kind sir. And our kind thanks to all of you for listening and supporting the show. Many more things coming up in the weeks and months ahead. Hopefully some stuff you'll like, newsletter stuff, and maybe a subscription-oriented component, and a little news feed on all kinds of stuff that's going on with forgotten teams of the past, and even fledgling new leagues and teams of today and the future. Lots of stuff bubbling up, and hopefully to come as the weeks and months roll on. So stay tuned to your feeds, and until next week, we encourage you to take care of yourselves and enjoy the fall, everybody. See ya.